Welcome. I trust you are ready for a new mystery to unfold.
The Stateroom Locked from Within, a Hercule Poirot mystery, narrated by Stephen from Cozy Mysteries. Good evening, mystery lovers, and welcome back to Cozy Mysteries. I'm Stephen, your host, and tonight I have a particularly intriguing tale to share with you. Pour yourself a warm cup of tea, settle into your favorite armchair, and let me transport you to the luxurious deck of the SS Britannica, where even the most careful plans can unravel like threads in a tapestry. Chapter 1. The Morning That Changed Everything. Our story begins on a crisp October morning in 1935, somewhere in the North Atlantic. The great ocean liner cut through the waves with the confidence of a floating palace, her passengers blissfully unaware that death had already claimed one of their number. The small, fastidiously dressed Belgian gentleman stood at the rail of the first-class promenade deck, his egg-shaped head tilted thoughtfully as he observed the churning waters below. His green eyes, bright with intelligence, reflected a mind that was never truly at rest. Even on vacation, it seemed, some habits died hard. Monsieur Poirot, the voice belonged to Dr. Morrison, the ship's physician, a portly man with kind eyes who had become something of a companion during the voyage. I trust you slept well. The seas were rather rough last night. The Belgian turned, his waxed moustache catching the morning light. Indeed, mon ami, though I confess the motion of the ship, she does not agree always with the delicate constitution of Hercule Poirot. But tell me, you seem troubled this morning. There is something, perhaps, Doctor. Morrison's face grew grave. I'm afraid there's been an incident. Mr. Randolph Ashworth, you know, the financier from New York, he was found dead in his stateroom this morning. The response was quiet, but those keen green eyes sharpened instantly. And the circumstances, they are natural. That's just it, Morrison said, lowering his voice as other passengers strolled past. The door was locked from the inside and the porthole was bolted shut from within as well. The steward had to get the purser to unlock the door with the master key. Most interesting. And Monsieur Ashworth, he was in good health. Appeared to be, yes, though Morrison hesitated. There's something else. His briefcase is missing, but curiously his passport and wallet were left untouched on the dresser. The Belgian's eyebrows rose slightly. The briefcase, it was valuable. According to his secretary, a Miss Caroline Webb who's travelling with him, he was carrying a substantial sum in negotiable bonds, nearly £50,000 worth. A small smile played at the corners of the detective's mouth. Ah, then we have here not merely a death, but a puzzle most intriguing. Tell me, mon ami, has the captain been informed? Captain Hartwell is beside himself. We dock in Southampton tomorrow, and he's terrified of the scandal. He's asked me to keep things quiet until we reach port. But of course such a request, it is most natural. However, the Belgian paused, straightening his already perfect tie. Hercule Poirot, he finds himself curious about this locked room mystery. Perhaps if the good captain would permit, I might offer my small services. Morrison's relief was palpable. Would you? Your reputation precedes you, even here at sea. I'm sure Captain Hartwell would be grateful for your assistance. Then it is settled. But first tell me, this morning, when was Monsieur Ashworth discovered? The steward Jenkins brought his breakfast tray at 8 o'clock as usual. When there was no answer to his knock, he assumed Mr. Ashworth was sleeping late. But when he returned at 9:30 with fresh towels and still received no response, he grew concerned and fetched the purser. And the condition of the room when they entered, undisturbed mostly. Ashworth was lying on his bed, fully dressed in his evening clothes from the night before. There was no sign of struggle, no obvious wounds. It appeared at first glance that he had simply expired. The Belgian nodded slowly. Yet the missing briefcase, she suggests otherwise. Tell me, were there any visitors to Monsieur Ashworth's cabin last evening? That's what makes this so puzzling. According to Jenkins, no one was seen entering or leaving the cabin after dinner. The corridor was quiet all evening. Ah, but the walls, they have ears, and the sea, she has many secrets. Come, mon ami, let us examine this room that locks itself from within, for I suspect that what appears to be an impossible crime may have a solution most logical indeed. As the two men made their way toward the first-class accommodations, neither noticed the figure that had been listening from behind the nearby lifeboat, nor the look of calculation that crossed the eavesdropper's face before melting back into the crowd of mourning passengers. The game, as they say, was afoot. Chapter 2: Secrets Behind Closed Doors. The first-class corridor stretched before them like a carpeted boulevard, its polished brass fittings gleaming under the electric lights. Cabin 12 stood at the far end, its door now guarded by a nervous-looking steward who straightened considerably at their approach. Jenkins, I presume. The Belgian's voice carried the authority of someone accustomed to being heard. You are the steward who discovered Monsieur Ashworth this morning? Yes, sir. Thomas Jenkins, sir. The young man's Cockney accent betrayed his East London origins. Been with the line for 3 years now, sir. Never had anything like this happen before. Naturellement. Now, tell to me exactly what occurred this morning, from the beginning, s'il vous plaît. Jenkins glanced nervously at Dr. Morrison before continuing. Well, sir, I brought Mr. Ashworth's breakfast at 8 sharp as always, kippers and eggs with his usual pot of Earl Grey, but when I knocked, there weren't no answer. His usual routine, it was what? Generally an early riser, sir. Always had his door open by the second knock, dressed proper and ready for his meal. Particular about his schedule he was. The Belgian nodded thoughtfully. Continue. When he didn't answer, I thought perhaps he'd had a late night. You know how gentlemen can be after the evening's entertainment. Jenkins coloured slightly, so I left the tray and went about my other duties. But when I returned at 9:30 with fresh towels, that's part of the morning routine, you see. Still no answer. And what did you do then? I grew worried, sir. Mr. Ashworth, he'd been quite specific about his requirements since boarding. Never missed his morning routine, not once in 5 days. So I fetched Mr. Pemberton, that's the purser, sir, and explained the situation. Dr. Morrison interjected. I was called down shortly after they opened the door. Ashworth was lying on his bed, still in his evening wear from the night before. The door, when you unlocked it, there was resistance. None at all, sir. Pemberton's voice came from behind them. The purser, a thin man with meticulous grooming habits, had arrived with a ring of keys that jangled softly as he walked. The lock turned smooth as silk, but the curious thing was the chain. It was fastened from the inside. Ah, the chain, most interesting. And the porthole, bolted tight from within, sir. I checked it myself. The Belgian examined the door frame carefully, his fingers tracing the wood around the lock mechanism. No signs of forcing, no scratches upon the metal. The lock, she is original to the ship. Yes, sir. Standard fitting throughout the first-class accommodations. And the master key, how many exist? Pemberton shifted uncomfortably. 3, sir. Mine, the captain's, and 1 kept in the ship's safe for emergencies. All accounted for. Yes, sir. I keep mine on my person at all times. The captain has his, and the emergency key was checked this morning. Still in the safe. The detective's green eyes narrowed slightly. Most thorough. Now, if you would be so kind as to permit me to examine the room. The cabin was elegantly appointed, as befitted first-class accommodation. A writing desk sat beneath the porthole, its surface neat except for the missing briefcase's outline in the dust. The bed, though disturbed by the body's removal, still held the impression of someone who had lain down fully clothed. The evening clothes he wore. Describe them to me. Dr. Morrison consulted his notes. Formal dinner attire. Black tailcoat, white shirt, white bow tie, all properly arranged, though the tie was somewhat askew, as if removed and replaced hastily. Possibly. I noted it but thought little of it at the time. The Belgian moved to the porthole, examining the bolting mechanism with care. The brass fitting was old but well maintained, showing no signs of tampering. He tested the handle. It moved smoothly, but required considerable force to operate. This porthole, when was it last opened? Jenkins, Pemberton looked to the steward. Yesterday afternoon, sir. Mr. Ashworth complained of the stuffiness and asked me to open it for fresh air. I closed it again before dinner service. The weather was turning rough. And you are certain you closed it properly? Yes, sir. Double-checked the bolt myself. Mr. Ashworth was particular about security, especially with that briefcase of his. Ah yes, the briefcase. Describe it, if you please. Leather, sir. Good quality with brass corners and a combination lock. Never let it out of his sight, he didn't. Even took it to dinner with him. The detective's eyebrows rose. To dinner. How unusual. And last evening? Jenkins nodded. Carried it down to the dining room as usual. But funny thing, when I saw him later in the smoking lounge, he didn't have it with him. What time was this? Around 10 o'clock, sir. I was collecting glasses from the lounge when I saw him playing cards with some other gentleman. Playing cards without his precious briefcase. Most interesting indeed. The Belgian turned slowly, taking in every detail of the room. Tell me, was anything else disturbed? Any personal effects moved or missing? Nothing else, sir. His passport, wallet, even his pocket watch, all exactly where you'd expect them to be. The detective nodded slowly, his mind already beginning to weave the threads of possibility into a pattern. But one thing was certain, this was no natural death, and the locked room was not as impossible as it appeared. Messieurs, he said finally, I believe we are dealing with a murderer of considerable cunning. But cunning, she has a way of revealing herself to those who know how to look. Chapter 3. The web of deception tightens. The ship's lounge buzzed with the subdued conversations of passengers who sensed something amiss but couldn't quite identify what. News traveled fast aboard a vessel at sea despite the crew's best efforts at discretion. The Belgian detective settled into a comfortable chair near the observation windows, watching the interplay of personalities with the keen interest of a naturalist studying species in their habitat. Monsieur Poirot. The voice was cultured, with the crisp diction of an expensive education. I understand you're looking into poor Randolph's death. I'm Caroline Webb, his secretary. The woman who approached was perhaps 35, with prematurely silver hair pulled back in an efficient chignon. Her black dress was elegant, but not ostentatious, and her pale eyes held an intelligence that the detective noted immediately. Mademoiselle Webb, please, sit. I understand you worked closely with Monsieur Ashworth. For 7 years. She settled into the chair across from him with practiced grace. This voyage was to be both business and pleasure. Randolph was negotiating the purchase of several properties in England, hence the negotiable bonds. Her composure flickered slightly. You know about those. Word travels, especially when it concerns such substantial sums. Tell me, these bonds, they were the reason for his, how you say, attachment to the briefcase. Partially. Randolph was naturally cautious about large transactions, but there was something else. She hesitated, glancing around the lounge. He'd been receiving threatening letters. The detective's eyes sharpened. And these letters, they concerned what exactly? Business rivals, he claimed. Men who felt he'd gained unfair advantages in previous deals. He showed me 3 of them over the past month, all unsigned, all promising consequences if he proceeded with the London acquisition. Did he take these threats seriously? seriously enough to book passage under an assumed name initially, though he thought better of it and reverted to his real identity before sailing. He said hiding would only make him look guilty. Guilty of what, precisely? Caroline Webb's hands twisted in her lap. There were irregularities in some of his recent transactions. Nothing illegal, he insisted, but ethically questionable. He'd been buying up properties through shell companies, then selling them to the city at inflated prices for public works projects. I see. And these shell companies, they were known to his business associates. Some suspected, but proving it would have been difficult. Randolph was very careful about documentation. The detective nodded thoughtfully. Now, last evening, you dined with him. Yes, at the captain's table. Randolph seemed unusually nervous, kept checking his watch. He barely touched his soup, and afterwards, he excused himself early, said he had letters to write. That was around 9 o'clock. I saw him later in the smoking lounge, but he seemed different. How? Relaxed, almost jovial. He was playing cards with 3 other men, Mr. Thornfield, the wool merchant, Dr. Sinclair, the archaeologist, and a gentleman I didn't recognize, well-dressed but with an American accent. He was winning, quite substantially, from what I could observe. His pile of chips was considerably larger than the others. The detective leaned forward slightly, and his briefcase. That's what was so odd. He never went anywhere without it, but that evening it wasn't with him. When I asked about it later, he just winked and said it was safely tucked away. He spoke to you again after the card game, briefly, near the elevator. It was past 11 by then. He seemed pleased with himself, almost giddy. Said something about killing 2 birds with 1 stone. A curious expression, under the circumstances. Did he mention returning to his cabin? He said he was tired and planned to retire immediately. That was the last time I saw him alive. The detective was quiet for a moment, processing this information. Mademoiselle, forgive the indelicate question, but what was the nature of your relationship with Monsieur Ashworth? Purely professional. Color rose in her cheeks. What are you implying? Nothing improper, I assure you. But 7 years is a long time to work closely with someone. Feelings they can develop, even when inappropriate. She was quiet for so long. He thought she might not answer. Finally, she spoke in a voice barely above a whisper. Randolph was married, Monsieur Poirot, unhappily, but married nonetheless. I may have harbored hopes that someday, but those hopes, they were not reciprocated. He was kind to me, generous with bonuses and praise, but his heart belonged to his business dealings. I was useful to him, nothing more. Yet you continued to work for him. The salary was excellent, and I genuinely believed I was helping build something important. His vision for urban development could have benefited thousands of people if implemented properly, but instead, it lined his pockets. I tried not to think about that part. The detective studied her face carefully. Caroline Webb was intelligent, capable, and had both motive and opportunity. But there was something about her manner that suggested grief rather than guilt. One more question, if you please. Did Monsieur Ashworth have any particular habits before retiring? Rituals, you might say. He was very methodical, always wrote in his diary before bed, reviewed his correspondence, then laid out his clothes for the next morning. He was quite proud of never needing an alarm clock. Said regularity was the key to success, yet he was found in his evening clothes. Yes, which is why I know something terrible happened. Randolph would never have slept in his formal wear, no matter how tired he was. As Caroline Webb took her leave, the detective remained in his chair, watching the endless expanse of ocean through the windows. The pieces of the puzzle were beginning to take shape, but the picture they formed was still frustratingly incomplete. Somewhere on this ship was a killer who had managed the seemingly impossible murder in a locked room, but Hercule Poirot had encountered impossible murders before. and experience had taught him that the impossible was merely the improbable waiting to be understood. Chapter 4. Midnight Visitors and Missing Pieces. The ship's dining room that evening was a study in forced normalcy. Passengers dressed in their finest attire, maintaining the pretense of civilized society, even as whispers about the morning's discovery circulated like smoke through the elegant space. The Belgian detective observed it all from his usual table, noting who seemed genuinely shocked, and who worked a little too hard to appear surprised. Monsieur Poirot, Dr. Sinclair, approached with the confidence of a man accustomed to respect. The archaeologist was perhaps 50, with greying temples and the kind of tan that spoke of years spent excavating in exotic locations. "I understand you're investigating poor Ashworth's death. Terrible business." "Indeed, Dr. Sinclair. Please join me. I believe you played cards with the deceased last evening, along with Thornfield and an American fellow. Davies, I think his name was. Ashworth cleaned us out quite thoroughly." Sinclair's laugh held no humor. "He seemed to know exactly which cards we were holding." "You suspect him of cheating?" "Let's say his luck was remarkably consistent, but then some men have all the advantages in life, don't they?" There was an edge to the comment that the detective didn't miss. "You knew Monsieur Ashworth before this voyage?" "Not personally, but by reputation. His business practices had affected some colleagues of mine in Egypt. He'd bought up several sites we'd planned to excavate, then demanded exorbitant fees for access. And these colleagues, they were angry. Furious. Years of planning, government permits, funding arrangements, all wasted because of Ashworth's greed." The detective nodded sympathetically. "Tell me about last evening's game. What time did it conclude?" "Around 11:30, I'd say." Ashworth seemed pleased with his winnings, though it wasn't about the money for him. He enjoyed the victory itself. "And after the game, we all went our separate ways. I stopped by the library to retrieve a book, then retired to my cabin. Deck bow, if you're wondering, quite a bit below the first-class accommodations." "Did you encounter anyone else during your return to your cabin?" Sinclair hesitated. "Actually, yes. As I was passing the elevator on a deck, I saw someone knocking on a door, rather persistently in fact." "Which door?" "I couldn't be certain. The corridor curves, and the lighting isn't ideal, but it was definitely in the first-class section." "Man or woman?" "The figure was wearing a long coat, so it was difficult to tell. Medium height, moving with purpose rather than stealth." "The time?" "Perhaps midnight, give or take a few minutes." This was the first mention of a midnight visitor. The detective leaned forward with renewed interest. "And you saw no one answer the door?" "If they did, it was after I'd passed. I heard the knocking continue as I waited for the elevator." "Most interesting. Did you mention this to the ship's officers?" "I'm mentioning it to you now. I wasn't certain it was relevant." The detective studied the archaeologist's face. Sinclair seemed forthright, but years of experience had taught him that murderers often were the most helpful witnesses, until they weren't. After Sinclair departed, the detective made his way to the purser's office, where he found Pemberton reviewing passenger manifests by lamplight. "Ah, Monsieur Poirot, I've been expecting you. I assume you want to know more about our passengers." "Indeed, specifically, about a Monsieur Davies, American, played cards with Ashworth last evening." Pemberton consulted his records. "James Davies, traveling alone, cabin B8. He boarded at New York, destination London. Paid for his passage in cash, which isn't unusual for Americans, but he did seem nervous during check-in." "Nervous how?" "Kept looking over his shoulder, asked several questions about the ship's security measures, said he was carrying valuable business documents." "Have you seen him since this morning's discovery?" "Come to think of it, no. He missed breakfast, and his steward mentioned that he'd placed a Do Not Disturb sign on his door." The detective's eyes narrowed. "Most convenient. I think, perhaps, I should like to meet this Monsieur Davies."
The journey to bed deck revealed a different world from the first-class accommodations above. The corridors were narrower, the carpeting less luxurious, and the passenger cabins significantly smaller. Cabin B8 sat in the middle of a long hallway, its door bearing the promised "Do Not Disturb" sign. The detective knocked firmly. "Monsieur Davies, Hercule Poirot, wishes to speak with you regarding last evening's card game." Silence. He knocked again, more insistently. "Monsieur, I know you are within. It would be better to speak now than to wait for the authorities in Southampton." The sound of movement came from within, footsteps, then the scraping of furniture. After several moments, the door opened just enough to reveal a thin face with worried eyes. "What do you want?" "To speak with you about Randolph Ashworth. I heard he died." "Natural causes," someone said. Someone was mistaken. "May I come in?" Davies reluctantly opened the door wider. The cabin was in disarray. Clothes scattered, drawers pulled open, papers strewn across the narrow desk. "Packing in haste, monsieur. The ship docks tomorrow." "I like to be prepared." "Indeed, though most passengers find unpacking more challenging than packing." "None." "Tell me about the card game last evening." Davies perched on the edge of his bed, hands clasped tightly. "What about it?" "We played poker. Ashworth won most of the pots. We called it a night." "You played honestly?" "Of course." "What are you suggesting?" "Nothing at all. But Ashworth, he was fortunate with the cards. Lucky, unlucky, doesn't matter now, does it?" The detective noticed a leather portfolio on the desk, partially hidden under scattered clothing. "You are in business, Monsieur Davies. Import-export. Nothing glamorous. And your business in London. Meeting with potential partners. Look, I'm sorry about Ashworth, but I barely knew the man. We played cards, made small talk, that's all." "What was the nature of this small talk?" Davies shifted uncomfortably. "The usual. Weather, the ship's amenities, business in general terms." He mentioned nothing about threats, business rivals who might wish him harm. Nothing like that. He seemed confident, almost cocky. Said he was about to settle old scores in London. The detective filed away this interesting phrase. "And after the game, you returned directly to your cabin?" "Yes, though I stopped for a drink at the bar first. Needed to clear my head after losing so much money." "The bartender, he would remember you." "Probably. I had several whiskies, more than I usually drink." As the detective prepared to leave, he paused at the door. "One more question, if you please. Last night, around midnight, you didn't perhaps take a walk through the ship, visit anyone?" Davies' face went pale. "No, I went straight to bed after the bar." "Why would you think otherwise?" "No reason, monsieur. No reason at all." But as he walked away, the detective was more certain than ever that James Davies was lying about something significant. The question was whether his lies concerned murder, or merely the guilty conscience of a man who had tried to cheat at cards, and failed. Chapter 5. The Steward's Secret. The crew quarters of the SS Britannica existed in a different world from the passenger accommodations above. Here, narrow corridors lined with metal doors led to cramped quarters shared by 2 or more crew members. The Belgian detective followed the ship's first officer through these utilitarian spaces, noting how the constant thrum of the engines was more pronounced here, close to the heart of the great vessel. "Jenkins shares quarters with the assistant cook," Officer Matthews explained as they walked. "Standard arrangement for junior crew members. He's been with us for 3 voyages now. Reliable, hard-working, no complaints from passengers." They stopped before a door marked Crew 47. Matthews knocked briskly. "Jenkins, there's a gentleman here wishes to speak with you." The door opened to reveal the young steward, now dressed in casual clothes, rather than his uniform. His face showed the strain of the day's events. "Oh, it's you, sir, the detective gentleman. Please, come in, though it's not much to look at." The cabin was indeed small. 2 narrow bunks, a single porthole, and barely enough floor space for one person to stand comfortably. Jenkins' bunkmate was absent, leaving them some privacy for conversation. "I hope you don't mind, sir, but I've been thinking about this morning, about Mr. Ashworth and, well, things I might not have mentioned before." The detective settled onto the single chair, noting the tension in the young man's posture. "Please, speak freely. Often the smallest details, they prove most significant. It's about that midnight knocking, sir. The one that Dr. Fellow mentioned at dinner. Word travels fast on a ship, and crew hears most everything. You know something of this knocking?" Jenkins nodded reluctantly. "I was doing my final rounds, checking that all cabin service requests were complete, making sure the corridors were tidy. Standard procedure for night duty. And I heard it too, sir. Someone knocking on a door, quite insistent-like. But here's what that doctor didn't see." "I did see who answered." The detective leaned forward. "Indeed, it was Mr. Ashworth himself, sir. Opened his door just enough to speak with whoever was there. I couldn't make out the words, but it seemed like they knew each other. The visitor, man or woman, hard to say for certain, sir. They were wearing one of those long traveling coats with a hood pulled up, but from the way they moved, I'd guess a woman." "And what happened after Mr. Ashworth answered?" "They spoke for maybe 2 minutes, then the visitor left. Mr. Ashworth closed his door, and I heard the chain being fastened." "You are certain it was the chain?" "Yes, sir. Makes a distinctive sound." "It does. I've heard it hundreds of times when passengers secure their doors for the night." This was crucial information. If Ashworth had chained his door after the midnight visit, then whoever killed him must have been someone he trusted enough to unchain it for, or someone who never left at all. "Jenkins, after this visitor departed, did you see them again, in the corridors, perhaps using the elevator?" "No, sir, and that's the odd thing. I continued my rounds for another 20 minutes, and I never saw anyone else in the first-class section." "There are other ways to move about the ship." "Well, sir, there are the service corridors, passages the crew uses to move between decks without disturbing passengers. But passengers don't generally know about those." "Show me." Jenkins led him through a maze of narrow passages behind the main corridors. These service ways were lit by bare bulbs, and smelled of cleaning supplies and machinery oil. They connected all the passenger decks, and led to various service areas throughout the ship. Someone familiar with the ship could move anywhere unseen, the detective observed. "Yes, sir, though it would require knowing the layout quite well. First-time passengers would get hopelessly lost." They returned to Jenkins' quarters, where the steward seemed eager to continue his confession. "There's something else, sir, about Mr. Ashworth's cabin this morning." "Go on." "When we opened the door, I noticed something that seemed off." "What exactly?" Jenkins hesitated, clearly uncomfortable. "Promise me you won't think I was stealing, sir." "I wasn't. I would never. I believe you." "What did you observe?" "On the dresser, beside Miss Ashworth's passport and wallet, there were some coins scattered about. Foreign ones, French francs, German marks, that sort. But when I'd cleaned his room yesterday, those coins were in a small leather pouch. Someone had emptied the pouch."
It seemed that way, sir, as if they'd been searching through it looking for something specific. And the pouch itself, gone, sir. Just the coins left behind. The detective's mind raced. A missing coin pouch, a midnight visitor, a briefcase full of bonds. The pieces were starting to form a pattern, though the complete picture remained elusive. "Jenkins, think carefully. During your 3 voyages with the line, have you encountered any passengers who seemed unusually interested in the ship's layout, who asked questions about crew passages or security arrangements?" The steward frowned in concentration. "Actually, sir, there was someone. Not this voyage, but the last one. New York to Liverpool in September. A lady travelling alone, quite elegant, but she seemed to know an awful lot about ships. Asked me detailed questions about crew schedules, about how the master keys worked, about which cabins had the best security. Do you recall her name? Mrs. Whitmore, I think it was. Said she was writing a book about ocean travel, tipped very generously for information. Describe her. Tall, well-dressed, with dark hair that might have been a wig. It never quite looked natural, had an accent I couldn't place. Not quite English, not quite American. The detective felt a familiar tingle of excitement. And you have not seen this woman on the current voyage? No, sir, but Jenkins hesitated again. Please, continue. Yesterday, when I was polishing the brass in the first-class corridor, I thought I glimpsed someone who moved like her. Same way of walking, very purposeful but quiet. But when I looked properly, they were gone. Where did you see this person? Near the elevator, sir. Just for a moment. Then they seemed to disappear into the service corridors, the detective thought. Someone with knowledge of the ship's layout, who had prepared for this voyage by gathering intelligence on a previous crossing. Someone who could move unseen and strike without warning. Jenkins, you have been most helpful. But tell me, why did you not mention these details this morning? The young man's face reddened. To be honest, sir, I was frightened. Mr. Ashworth was an important man, and if someone was clever enough to kill him in a locked room, well, what might they do to a steward who saw too much? The detective nodded understandingly. Fear was a reasonable response to murder, but it was also a luxury he couldn't afford. Somewhere on this ship was a killer who had committed what seemed to be the perfect crime, but perfection in his experience was an illusion. Every criminal made mistakes, and the key was knowing where to look for them. Chapter 6. The Bonds of Greed. The ship's strongroom was located deep in the vessel's belly, protected by thick steel doors and accessible only to the highest-ranking officers. Captain Hartwell himself escorted the detective to this secure area, his weathered face grim with the weight of command and scandal. I've never had a murder aboard my ship, Poirot, the captain said as he worked the combination on the heavy safe. In 30 years at sea, the worst I've dealt with was the occasional passenger dispute or petty theft. Murder, she is a different beast entirely, Captain. But tell me, why do we visit your strongroom? Because of something my purser discovered this morning. After we heard about Ashworth's missing briefcase, I ordered an inventory of anything valuable passengers might have deposited for safekeeping. The safe door swung open, revealing neat compartments filled with jewelry cases, important documents, and several leather portfolios. Captain Hartwell reached for one particular item, a briefcase that looked remarkably similar to the description of Ashworth's missing property. This was deposited yesterday evening at 11:47. According to our log, the captain explained. The timing troubled me, given what we now know about Ashworth's death. The detective examined the briefcase carefully. Fine leather, brass corners, combination lock, exactly matching Jenkins' description. And who deposited this item? That's the peculiar thing. According to Pemberton's records, it was Miss Caroline Webb. She claimed it contained important business documents that needed secure storage. The detective's eyebrows rose significantly. Miss Webb deposited Ashworth's briefcase after the card game ended. Most interesting indeed. She had the authority apparently. Ashworth had given her power of attorney for certain business matters, including access to safe deposit arrangements, and the contents. We haven't opened it, of course. That would require either Miss Webb's permission or a court order. The detective studied the briefcase more carefully, noting a small scratch near the lock that hadn't been visible in the dim lighting of Ashworth's cabin. Captain, under the circumstances of suspicious death, surely we might examine what was so important it needed immediate securing. Captain Hartwell hesitated, clearly uncomfortable with the legal implications. If you think it's absolutely necessary, I believe it may reveal the motive for murder. The captain nodded reluctantly and called for Pemberton to bring the deposit documentation. When the purser arrived, His face was flushed with embarrassment. "Sir, there's been a complication. Miss Webb came to retrieve the briefcase an hour ago, claiming she needed to prepare important papers for the authorities in Southampton, and you gave it to her." The captain's voice carried the edge of command authority. "She had proper authorization, sir. The power of attorney documentation was in order, and she knew the deposit code." The detective's mind raced. Caroline Webb had deposited the briefcase shortly after Ashworth's card game ended, then retrieved it today after his body was discovered. The timing suggested either exceptional foresight or guilty knowledge. "Where is Miss Webb now?" "I believe she's in her cabin, sir. Deck A, cabin A18. The journey to Caroline Webb's cabin was made in tense silence. The detective's earlier impression of the secretary, grief-stricken but honest, was now complicated by her possession of the missing briefcase. Had she been protecting her employer's assets, or had she killed him for them? They found cabin A18's door slightly ajar, voices coming from within. The detective gestured for silence and moved closer to listen. "Told you the bonds would be here by morning, and they are." Caroline's voice, but strained with an emotion he couldn't identify. "The arrangements have changed." A man's voice, unfamiliar with a slight accent. "After what happened to Ashworth, we need to move more carefully. You said there would be no violence. You promised me plans evolve, my dear Caroline. Your former employer proved more resistant than anticipated." The detective signaled to Captain Hartwell, who knocked firmly on the door. "Miss Webb, Captain Hartwell here. I need to speak with you immediately." The voices inside stopped abruptly. After a moment, Caroline opened the door, her face pale but composed. Behind her, the detective glimpsed a tall man in a dark coat moving toward what appeared to be a connecting door between cabins. "Captain, is there some problem? We need to discuss the briefcase you deposited in our strong room yesterday evening." Her composure cracked slightly. Of course, I was protecting Randolph's business interests. By removing them from the scene of his death, I deposited the briefcase before his death, Captain. I had no idea what would happen." The detective stepped forward. "Mademoiselle Webb, who was the gentleman with whom you were speaking?" "Gentleman? I don't understand." "The man who just left through your connecting door. The one who spoke of arrangements and resistance." Her eyes darted toward the connecting door, now firmly closed. "You must be mistaken. I've been alone since this morning." Captain Hartwell moved past her into the cabin. The connecting door was locked from the other side, but through the thin wall they could hear movement in the adjacent room. "Whose cabin connects to yours?" the detective asked. Caroline remained silent, but Pemberton consulted his passenger manifest. "Cabin A17 is registered to a Mr. James Davies, the same James Davies who had played cards with Ashworth, who had been nervous about security, who had claimed to go directly to his cabin after losing at poker. But his cabin was listed as B8, not A17. It seems Monsieur Davies has been economical with the truth about his accommodations," the detective observed. "Two cabins suggest either great wealth or great need for privacy, or both," Captain Hartwell added grimly. The detective turned back to Caroline Webb, noting how her hands trembled despite her attempts at composure. "Mademoiselle, I believe the time has come for complete honesty. Your association with Monsieur Davies, the briefcase, the negotiable bonds, all of it is connected to Ashworth's death, is it not?" She sank into a chair, her carefully maintained facade finally crumbling. "You don't understand. Randolph wasn't the victim you think he was. He destroyed lives, ruined honest people for profit. What we planned, it was justice. Justice that required murder. No." The word came out as a cry. "It was never supposed to go that far. We only wanted to retrieve what he had stolen, to return the money to the people he had cheated. Yet he is dead, and you possess his bonds." The bonds were payment for a transaction that never should have happened. Randolph bought those properties with money stolen from a pension fund, my father's pension fund. Hundreds of elderly people lost their life savings because of his greed. The detective studied her face, seeing the pain of personal betrayal beneath the anger. So you conspired with Monsieur Davies to recover these bonds. James worked for the insurance company that was investigating Randolph's dealings. He had evidence of the fraud, but not enough to convict in court. When he learned Randolph would be traveling with the bonds, you saw an opportunity for private justice. She nodded miserably. It seemed so simple. James would confront Randolph with the evidence, force him to sign over the bonds voluntarily. No one would be hurt. But Ashworth refused. He laughed at us, said we could never prove anything, that he was beyond our reach. When James threatened to expose him publicly, Randolph became violent. The detective absorbed this information, noting what Caroline hadn't said. And in this violence somehow Ashworth ended up dead in a locked room. Before she could answer, the sound of splintering wood came from the connecting door. Captain Hartwell stepped back as the door burst open, revealing James Davies with a pistol in his hand and desperation in his eyes. "I'm afraid this conversation is over," Davies said quietly. "Caroline, get the briefcase. We're leaving." Chapter 7. The truth surfaces. The small cabin felt even more cramped with 4 people and a loaded pistol occupying the space. James Davies positioned himself where he could watch both the main door and the window, his weapon steady despite the ship's gentle motion. The Belgian detective observed him with professional interest, noting the man's controlled panic and the way his eyes never quite met anyone's gaze directly. "Monsieur Davies, or should I say, Monsieur Davies will suffice for now." The accent was definitely American, but with undertones that suggested European origins, though I suspect you've already deduced more than you're letting on. Indeed, you are not merely an insurance investigator, are you? The cabin arrangement, the knowledge of ship security, the careful planning, this suggests someone with considerable experience in, shall we say, acquisitions. Davies smiled grimly. "You could say that, though I prefer to think of myself as someone who recovers stolen property." Captain Hartwell stepped forward slightly. "See here, you can't threaten passengers on my ship. Captain, please remain where you are." Davies' voice carried quiet authority. "I have no wish to harm anyone, but I will not allow 30 years of careful work to be destroyed by one greedy man's refusal to accept justice." The detective filed away that interesting phrase, 30 years. "Caroline mentioned that Ashworth stole from a pension fund. Your investigation, it was personal, none. My father worked 43 years for the company Ashworth destroyed. When the pension fund collapsed, my father lost everything. He died 6 months later, broken and penniless." Davies' hand tightened on the pistol. "I've spent 3 decades tracking every dollar Ashworth stole, building evidence, waiting for the right moment, and this voyage provided that moment. When I learned he was traveling with negotiable bonds worth exactly what he stole from the pension fund, it seemed like providence." Caroline Webb had been silent during this exchange, but now she spoke in a voice barely above a whisper. "Tell him what really happened, James. Tell him how Randolph died." Davies's composure flickered. "Caroline, don't. No, I can't carry this anymore. He deserves to know the truth." The detective leaned forward slightly, sensing the moment when secrets would finally be revealed. "Mademoiselle, please continue." "After the card game, James came to my cabin, not Randolph's. We reviewed our plan one final time. I was to get Randolph to open his door by claiming there was an urgent telegram. Then James would confront him with the evidence. But the plan, it went wrong. Everything went wrong." Tears began to flow down Caroline's cheeks. "When we knocked at midnight, Randolph did answer, but he immediately recognized James from the insurance investigation. He tried to slam the door, but James forced his way in.
And then, Davies took over the narrative, his voice flat and emotionless. Ashworth was stronger than he looked. We struggled, and he managed to grab a heavy brass candlestick from his dresser. When he swung it at my head, I pushed him away, harder than I intended. He fell backward onto the bed. He struck his head on the metal bed frame. There was so much blood. Davies's voice trailed off. Yet when he was found, there were no obvious wounds. Caroline answered this time. I'm a trained nurse, Monsieur Poirot. Before I became a secretary, I worked in a hospital. I knew how to make it look like natural causes. Ah, you cleaned the wound, arranged the body, made it appear he had simply died in his sleep. I couldn't let James be charged with murder for an accident. Randolph's death was tragic, but it was also justice for what he had done to so many people. The detective nodded slowly, the pieces of the puzzle finally forming a complete picture. But there remained the problem of the locked room. How did you both leave when the door was chained from within? Davies and Caroline exchanged glances. That's where Caroline's knowledge of ships proved invaluable. The porthole, the detective said. But surely a person could not fit through such a small opening. Not a person, no, but the briefcase could. Caroline lowered it on a rope to the deck below, where I retrieved it later. And you yourself, Monsieur Davies. The service corridors Caroline had learned about during her previous voyage. She had mapped them carefully, knowing we might need an escape route. Previous voyage. But mademoiselle, you told me you had worked for Ashworth for 7 years. Caroline's face reddened. I lied about that. I only met Randolph 6 months ago, when I applied for the secretary position specifically to get close to him. The previous voyage was reconnaissance, learning the ship's layout, identifying potential opportunities. So your grief this morning, it was entirely performance. Not entirely. I may have hated what Randolph represented, but I never wanted him to die. The plan was to force him to sign over the bonds, then disappear. His death, that was never supposed to happen. Captain Hartwell had been listening to this confession with growing horror. You're both admitting to conspiracy, theft and concealing evidence in a death. Captain, the detective said quietly, perhaps you might allow me to continue. There are still details that puzzle me. Davies gestured with the pistol for him to proceed. The midnight knocking that Jenkins heard, that was your first attempt to enter Ashworth's cabin, but he refused to open the door fully, suspicious of your presence. You had to return later, when Caroline could provide a more convincing reason for the visit. Correct. The first attempt failed, because Ashworth was more paranoid than we expected, and the coins scattered on his dresser. Caroline answered. We were searching for the briefcase combination. Randolph kept important numbers written on small pieces of paper hidden in unusual places. The coin pouch was one of his favorite hiding spots. Did you find the combination? No, which is why we had to take the entire briefcase. James is skilled at opening such locks, given time and proper tools. The detective absorbed all of this, then asked the question that had been troubling him most. But why, after successfully making the death appear natural, did you then deposit the briefcase in the ship's strong room? That action drew attention to what might have remained hidden. Davies and Caroline looked at each other, and for the first time, the detective saw genuine confusion pass between them. I never deposited any briefcase, Caroline said slowly. Nor did I, Davies added. We planned to keep it hidden until we could examine the contents properly. The detective felt that familiar tingle that came when a case took an unexpected turn. Then who deposited Ashworth's briefcase in the strong room? And more importantly, what happened to the one you took from his cabin? Chapter 8. Shadows within shadows. The cabin fell silent, except for the steady thrum of the ship's engines. The detective could see the confusion in both Davies's and Caroline's faces, and his experienced eye told him their bewilderment was genuine. Someone else had been playing a deeper game, using their conspiracy as cover for their own purposes. Monsieur Davies, the briefcase you removed from Ashworth's cabin, where is it now? Hidden in my real cabin, B.A. We planned to examine the contents this morning, after the initial investigation was complete, and you are certain it contained the negotiable bonds. We never opened it. The lock mechanism was more complex than I anticipated, and we decided to wait until we had privacy and proper tools. The detective's mind raced through the implications. Captain, might we examine the deposit records more carefully? Specifically, what identification was presented when the briefcase was placed in your strong room? Captain Hartwell consulted with Pemberton, who had been standing quietly near the door throughout the confrontation. According to our records, Miss Webb presented her passport and a notarized power of attorney document. May I see this documentation? Pemberton produced a folder containing photocopies of the relevant papers. The detective studied them with interest, noting the quality of the forgery. For forgery it certainly was. Mademoiselle Webb, this is not your signature on the power of attorney. I've never seen that document before in my life. And Captain, who was the night officer who accepted this deposit? Sub-Lieutenant Morrison, not Dr. Morrison, but his nephew who works in ship's operations. He was covering the evening watch. I should like to speak with this gentleman immediately. I'm afraid that's impossible, Pemberton interjected. Sub-Lieutenant Morrison reported sick this morning, and has been confined to quarters. Another convenient illness, the detective thought. And where are these quarters? Officer deck, cabin C12. Davies had been following this conversation with growing agitation. You're suggesting someone else was involved, someone who knew about our plan, more than knew about it, monsieur. Someone who used your plan as the perfect cover for their own crime, but who could have known? The detective turned to Caroline. Think carefully. During your reconnaissance voyage, did you confide in anyone, perhaps someone who seemed sympathetic to your cause? Caroline's face went pale. There was. On the previous crossing, I met a woman in the ship's library, Mrs. Whitmore. She was very interested in my story about working for Randolph, and she seemed to understand my anger about his business practices. The same Mrs. Whitmore that Jenkins mentioned, the woman who asked detailed questions about ship security. It's possible. She was very elegant, very knowledgeable about ocean travel, said she was writing a book, but now that I think about it, she asked more questions than she answered. Davies lowered his pistol slightly. You think this woman was planning her own operation? I think, monsieur, that you and Mademoiselle Webb were what chess players call useful pawns. Someone allowed you to believe you were in control while they arranged the pieces for their own game. The detective moved to the cabin's porthole and gazed out at the endless ocean. Consider the perfect crime. Ashworth dies in a locked room, appearing to be natural causes. His conspirators remove what they believe to be his briefcase, making them the obvious suspects if the death is later revealed to be murder. Meanwhile, the real briefcase and the real bonds disappear into the ship's own security system, to be retrieved by someone with proper documentation and authority. But the documentation was forged, Captain Hartwell protested. Indeed, but by someone skilled enough to fool your night officer, someone with access to Caroline's personal information, someone who knew exactly when and how to make the substitution. Caroline sank into a chair, the full implications beginning to dawn on her. You mean while James and I were struggling with Randolph, someone else was in his cabin, or someone who entered shortly after you left? Tell me, when you departed through the service corridors, did either of you secure the cabin door? Davies shook his head. We were too focused on escaping unseen. Caroline locked the connecting door between my two cabins, but Ashworth's main door was left unlocked. And since the porthole was already open for your briefcase escape route, someone familiar with the ship could have entered from outside. From outside? Captain Hartwell looked incredulous. That's impossible. We're in the middle of the Atlantic. Not from the ocean, Captain, from the deck below. A rope and a pulley, the same method Caroline used to lower the briefcase, could easily lift a person of moderate size through the porthole. The detective turned back to the group. Our true criminal waited until the excitement of your escape had passed, then entered Ashworth's cabin, secured the real briefcase, and arranged the scene to look exactly as you had left it. They then sealed the porthole from within and departed through the main door, which they locked and chained from the outside. But that's impossible, Davies protested. You can't chain a door from the outside, not normally, no. But someone with intimate knowledge of ship construction might know about service access panels, hidden spaces where maintenance workers can reach mechanical systems. The detective's green eyes gleamed with the satisfaction of a puzzle nearly solved. Jenkins mentioned that Mrs. Whitmore seemed unusually knowledgeable about ships. I suspect our criminal is not merely familiar with ocean liners, but has worked aboard them. Captain Hartwell was already reaching for the ship's communication system. Pemberton, I want a complete crew, manifest cross-referenced with passenger lists from our last 6 voyages, and find Sub-Lieutenant Morrison immediately. Sir, about Morrison, what about him? When we went to check on him this morning, his cabin was empty. His belongings were gone, and his uniform was hanging in the wardrobe, as if he'd simply walked away from his position. The detective smiled grimly, or as if Morrison was never Morrison at all, but rather Mrs. Whitmore, in a very clever disguise. Tell me, Captain, was this Morrison a new addition to your crew? Joined us in New York for this crossing, came with excellent references from another shipping line, references that upon investigation will prove to be as fictitious as Mrs. Whitmore's book project and Caroline's power of attorney documents. Davies finally lowered his weapon completely. You're saying we've been manipulated by a professional criminal. I'm saying, monsieur, that while you were planning to steal from a thief, someone else was planning to steal from you. The question now is, where is our missing crew member, and can we apprehend them before they disappear forever into the port of Southampton? Chapter 9. The hunter becomes the hunted. The search for the mysterious crew member who had posed as Sub-Lieutenant Morrison began immediately. Captain Hartwell ordered a complete sweep of the ship, but the Belgian detective suspected their quarry was far too clever to be hiding in obvious places. Instead, he focused on understanding how someone could maintain such an elaborate deception aboard a vessel where everyone's movements were closely monitored. The references from the other shipping line, he asked Pemberton as they reviewed personnel files in the purser's office. Do you have the original documents? Of course, standard procedure requires complete documentation before hiring. The papers looked authentic. Letterhead, official seals, signatures, but the detective's trained eyes spotted the subtle inconsistencies that marked professional forgery. More importantly, the supposed previous employment was with a shipping line that had gone out of business 6 months earlier. A convenient choice, he murmured. Difficult to verify credentials from a company that no longer exists.
Dr. Morrison, the ship's physician, joined them in the office, his face troubled. I've been thinking about my nephew's behavior since he came aboard. He seemed different from the young man I remembered. Different how, Doctor? More confident, more worldly. When I'd last seen him 3 years ago, he was rather shy and inexperienced. The Morrison who joined this crew was polished, almost sophisticated. And you accepted this change. People mature, especially in demanding professions. I was pleased to see him developing such competence. The detective nodded thoughtfully. Tell me, during this voyage, did your nephew show particular interest in any passengers? Ask questions about their activities or accommodations? Actually, yes. He was quite curious about Mr. Ashworth, asked several questions about his routine and habits, said he was impressed by such a successful businessman. And you shared this information? Dr. Morrison's face reddened. I may have mentioned that Ashworth was travelling with valuable documents, that he seemed quite security conscious about his briefcase. I thought it was natural professional curiosity, most natural indeed. Your nephew was gathering intelligence for his operation. Captain Hartwell burst into the office, his face grim. We've searched the entire ship. No sign of Morrison or anyone matching his description. It's as if he simply vanished. Has anyone checked the lifeboats? First thing we looked at. All boats are accounted for and properly secured. The detective stroked his mustache thoughtfully. Yet someone cannot simply disappear from a ship in the middle of the ocean. There must be. He was interrupted by a commotion in the corridor outside. Jenkins appeared in the doorway, breathing hard from running. Sirs, you need to come quickly. We've found something in the laundry. They followed the steward through the ship's service areas to the laundry facility, where several crew members stood around a large canvas bag. The ship's laundry supervisor, a stout woman named Mrs. Patterson, gestured toward the bag with evident distress. Found it in the sorting bin this morning, we did. Thought it was just another load of linens. But when we opened it, inside the bag was a complete ship's officer uniform, along with a brown wig, false mustache, and various pieces of theatrical makeup. At the bottom lay a passport bearing Morrison's photograph and name, but when the detective examined it closely, he could see where the photograph had been carefully altered. The transformation of Mrs. Whitmore into Sub-Lieutenant Morrison, he observed. Most professional work. But where is she now? Captain Hartwell demanded. That, mon capitaine, is the question that troubles me most. However, I suspect our criminal is still aboard, simply in a different disguise. Mrs. Patterson stepped forward hesitantly. Begging your pardon, sir, but there was something else in the bag. A ticket. She produced a small piece of paper, a passenger ticket for the ship's tender service at Southampton. The ticket was made out to Mrs. E. Thornfield, and included a private cabin reservation at the port's most exclusive hotel. Thornfield, the detective mused. Where have we heard that name? Dr. Morrison snapped his fingers. The wool merchant who played cards with Ashworth. Mr. Thornfield was one of the players that final evening. Indeed, and if my theory is correct, Mrs. E. Thornfield is the wife of this wool merchant, or at least that is the identity our criminal has now assumed. They hurried back to the passenger decks, where they found Mr. Thornfield taking afternoon tea in the first-class lounge. He was a heavy-set man with a ruddy complexion and the comfortable manner of someone accustomed to success. Mr. Thornfield, Captain Hartwell approached with diplomatic care. Might we have a word about your wife? Thornfield looked up in surprise. My wife? She's not aboard, Captain. Stayed home in Yorkshire, doesn't care for sea travel. Yet we have evidence suggesting a Mrs. E. Thornfield has booked passage on tomorrow's tender. Impossible. My Eleanor is terrified of water, won't even cross a river by bridge if she can help it. The detective stepped forward. Mrs. Thornfield, during the card game 2 evenings ago, did you mention your wife to any of the other players? Certainly. Ashworth was asking about family, business connections, that sort of thing. Friendly conversation between games, and you told him your wife's name. Eleanor, yes, and that she managed the business correspondence while I was traveling. Ashworth seemed quite interested in successful business partnerships. Did anyone else show particular interest in these details about your wife? Thornfield considered this. Come to think of it, that American fellow Davies asked several questions about domestic arrangements, said he was considering marriage himself, and wondered how successful men managed to balance business travel with family life. The detective and Captain Hartwell exchanged glances. Their criminal had been gathering information systematically, building the foundation for the next identity in what was clearly a well-planned escape route. Mr. Thornfield, I need you to contact your wife immediately by wireless. Verify that she is safely at home and has not applied for any travel documents. Of course, but I don't understand. Someone is planning to travel as Mrs. Eleanor Thornfield tomorrow morning. Someone who has studied your personal details carefully enough to assume her identity convincingly. As Thornfield hurried away to send his wireless message, the detective turned to Captain Hartwell. Our criminal is preparing to disembark as the wife of a passenger, using an identity that would pass casual scrutiny. But we now have advance warning of the plan. Should we confront all the women passengers? Not yet. I suspect our Mrs. Whitmore Morrison Thornfield is too clever to begin her transformation until the last possible moment. But we shall be ready when she does. The detective paused, struck by a sudden thought. Captain, the tender tickets, who has access to them? They're issued by the purser's office, but passengers can also purchase them directly from. Captain Hartwell stopped, his face paling. From any officer with proper authorization, including a Sub-Lieutenant Morrison, who had 2 days to prepare his escape route while maintaining perfect access to ship's services. The trap was beginning to close, but the detective knew their quarry had survived this long by being unpredictable. The final confrontation would require both careful planning and considerable luck. Chapter 10: The Final Hand. Dawn was breaking over Southampton as the great liner approached her berth, the familiar outline of the English coast growing larger with each passing minute. The Belgian detective stood at the rail of the promenade deck, watching the tender boats preparing for the first wave of passengers to disembark. Somewhere among the excited travelers gathering their belongings was a killer who believed she had committed the perfect crime. All preparations are complete, Captain Hartwell reported quietly. Port authorities have been briefed, and we have officers positioned at every departure point. Excellent. And Monsieur Thornfield's wife, confirmed safe at home in Yorkshire. She hasn't left the house in 3 days, and certainly hasn't applied for any travel documents. The detective nodded, his green eyes scanning the crowd of first-class passengers assembling on deck. Our criminal will be confident now, believing herself beyond our reach. But confidence, she can make one careless. Davies and Caroline Webb stood under guard nearby, their conspiracy exposed but their role in the larger crime now understood to be that of unwitting accomplices. The real briefcase, the one they had taken from Ashworth's cabin, had indeed contained worthless papers, convincing replicas of the negotiable bonds that had been switched sometime during the card game. She played a long game, the detective observed to Dr. Morrison, who had joined him at the rail. Months of preparation, multiple identities, careful study of her target's weaknesses and habits. Do you really think she's still aboard? Oh, she is here, mon ami. Where else could she go? But watch carefully. Our criminal will not appear as Mrs. Whitmore or Sub-Lieutenant Morrison. She will be someone entirely new, someone who has existed only since yesterday evening. The first tender was loading passengers, and the detective moved closer to observe the process. Each passenger presented their ticket and identification to a ship's officer before being allowed aboard the smaller vessel. The system was efficient and normally quite secure. There, the detective said suddenly, pointing to an elegantly dressed woman in widow's weeds approaching the tender platform. Observe the lady in black. Captain Hartwell studied the figure. She looks like dozens of other passengers. What makes you suspect? The way she moves. Despite the mourning clothes and veiled hat, she cannot disguise her natural grace. It is the same controlled movement Jenkins observed in the corridor, the same purposeful walk that Caroline noticed during her reconnaissance voyage. The woman in black presented her ticket and passport with the practiced ease of experienced travel. Even at a distance, the detective could see that her documentation appeared to be in perfect order. Mrs. Eleanor Thornfield, traveling alone, the ship's officer announced loudly enough for them to hear. Cabin reservation confirmed at the Grand Hotel. Should we stop her now? Captain Hartwell asked urgently. Not yet. Let her board the tender, but ensure our people are watching her every move. The woman settled into a seat near the front of the tender, her posture betraying no anxiety despite being so close to escape. The detective had to admire her composure. Even knowing she was being hunted, she maintained perfect control. Captain, have your wireless operator send a message to the port authorities. Tell them to delay the tender's departure by exactly 10 minutes. On what pretext? Routine customs inspection. It will seem normal to the passengers. As the tender filled with its complement of passengers, the detective made his final preparations. Dr. Morrison, I need you to do something for me. Approach the woman in mourning clothes and offer your medical assistance. Tell her you noticed she seemed unwell during the voyage, but I never saw her before this morning. Exactly, that should provoke an interesting reaction. Dr. Morrison approached the tender and spoke briefly with the officer in charge before boarding. The detective watched as he made his way to the woman in black, observing her reaction carefully through the tender's windows. The woman's response was immediate and telling. She turned sharply away from Dr. Morrison, then stood abruptly and moved toward the rear of the tender. Her movement was no longer graceful but urgent, almost panicked. Now, Captain. Captain Hartwell signaled to the port authorities, who immediately boarded the tender. The detective followed, his mind racing through the final pieces of the puzzle. Mrs. Thornfield, he called out as he approached the woman in black. Or should I say, Mrs. Whitmore? Or perhaps you prefer Sub-Lieutenant Morrison? The woman turned slowly, and for the first time since the investigation began, the detective saw genuine fear in someone's eyes. Her disguise was masterful. Aged makeup, carefully styled grey hair beneath the veil, even padded clothing to change her apparent figure, but her eyes betrayed her. I'm afraid there's been some mistake, she said, in a voice pitched carefully higher than her natural tone. I am Mrs. Eleanor Thornfield, travelling to London on business. Indeed. Then you will not mind if we verify this with your husband, who is still aboard the ship. The woman's composure cracked visibly. My husband is not, we are separated. Curious. He made no mention of a separation when we spoke with him this morning. In fact, he specifically described his wife Eleanor as being afraid of water travel. The detective gestured to the port authorities. I believe you will find that this lady's passport, while expertly forged, bears fingerprints that do not match those of Eleanor Thornfield. More importantly, I suspect you will discover that she is carrying negotiable bonds worth £50,000, bonds stolen from the cabin of a murdered man. The woman made one final attempt at deception. This is preposterous. I demand to speak with the British consul. Certainly, madame. I am sure he will be most interested in your collection of false identities and your rather specialized knowledge of maritime security systems. As the port authorities moved to arrest her, the woman finally abandoned her disguise completely. Her voice, when she spoke again, was crisp and cultured, with the faint European accent Jenkins had remembered. You're quite clever, Monsieur Poirot. I had hoped my misdirection with the American couple would be sufficient. Your plan was indeed brilliant, the detective acknowledged. But you made one crucial error, which was, you assumed that greed and desperation would blind Davies and Caroline to the larger picture. But their very guilt made them more observant, not less. When they realized they had been manipulated, the truth became inevitable. The woman smiled bitterly. And I suppose you'll want to know my real name. It matters little. What matters is that Randolph Ashworth's killer has been found, and his stolen bonds will be returned to their rightful owners. As the authorities led her away, she called back over her shoulder, You know, Poirot, Ashworth really was a despicable man. The world is better without him. Perhaps, madame, but that judgment was not yours to make. Epilogue. Justice served. The afternoon sun streamed through the windows of the ship's lounge as the detective completed his final report for Captain Hartwell. The SS Britannica would remain in port for several additional days while authorities completed their investigation, but the truth of Randolph Ashworth's death was now fully revealed. So the briefcase in our strong room was the real one all along? Captain Hartwell asked, still trying to piece together the complex deception. Indeed, Captain. Our criminal, whose real name we have learned, is Anna Kozlova, a former circus performer turned professional thief, switched the briefcases during the card game itself. While Ashworth was distracted by his winning streak, she managed to substitute a duplicate containing worthless papers. But how could she have known about Davies and Caroline's plan? She didn't know the specifics, but she recognized the signs. Caroline's questions during the previous voyage, Davies's nervous behavior, their obvious interest in Ashworth. To someone of Kozlova's experience, it was clear that some sort of operation was being planned. Dr. Morrison shook his head in amazement. She used their conspiracy as cover for her own crime. Precisely. She knew that if Ashworth died under mysterious circumstances, Davies and Caroline would become the obvious suspects. Meanwhile, she could retrieve the real bonds and disappear with a perfect alibi. What will happen to Davies and Caroline? The detective considered this carefully. That will be for the courts to decide. Their crime was theft and conspiracy, but not murder. They may find some sympathy from a jury who learns of Ashworth's business practices. And Kozlova. She will face charges for murder, theft, fraud, and a dozen other crimes. I suspect her career in deception has finally come to an end. Captain Hartwell closed the case file with evident relief. I must say, Poirot, I'm grateful for your assistance. Without your insight we might never have unraveled this complex web. The truth, mon capitaine. She has a way of revealing herself to those who know how to listen. In this case, the sea kept many secrets, but not from justice. As the detective prepared to disembark, Jenkins appeared with his luggage, the young steward's face still bearing traces of the shock he had experienced. Will you be taking many more voyages, sir? Jenkins asked as they walked toward the gangway. Perhaps, mon ami. The ocean, she is vast and full of mysteries, but I find that most mysteries, when properly examined, have quite logical solutions, even locked room murders. The detective smiled, his green eyes twinkling with satisfaction. Especially locked room murders, Jenkins, for you see there is no such thing as an impossible crime, only crimes where we have not yet discovered the method. As he walked down the gangway toward the bustling port of Southampton, the detective reflected on the case that had begun with a man found dead in a room locked from within. In the end it had proven to be a tale of greed, justice, and the dangerous game that criminals play when they believe themselves clever enough to commit the perfect crime. But Hercule Poirot had learned long ago that there was no such thing as the perfect crime. Only criminals who had not yet been caught by someone patient enough to observe, intelligent enough to deduce, and persistent enough to pursue the truth wherever it might lead. The stateroom had indeed been locked from within, but the real prison had been the web of deception that ultimately trapped its creator. Justice, like the tide, had a way of reaching even the most carefully protected shores. And there, my dear listeners of Cozy Mysteries, concludes our tale of the stateroom locked from within. I hope you've enjoyed this journey across the Atlantic, with the incomparable detective, and his methodical unraveling of what seemed to be an impossible crime. Until next time, this is Stephen reminding you that the truth, no matter how cleverly hidden, always finds a way to surface. Sweet dreams, and happy sleuthing.